Oh, we got some great songs coming up.
Ooh. Wow.
And it's 10 o'clock. You know, those of you who've been in meetings know that my internal clock, I have to start on time. However, I'm going to hold off because I know we still have more people coming, and some people have problems joining teams from outside. So I'm going to hold off for a minute and try to keep my internal panic clock a little bit tempered. So for those of you just joining, put in your name and where you work, your title, and your 5 favorite songs for us to, no judging. Here Comes the Sun, Todd, that's a great one. I don't know, here in the bubble of Westerville, as I call it, suburb of Columbus, it's sunny and it's going to be 50. I'm used to Northeast Ohio weather where it's cloudy and snowy 8 months of the year. Oh, Jennifer said Cleveland is sunny and 52 today. Wow, that's shorts weather. Shorts and flip-flops are going to be out in the grocery store. All right, it looks like we are all more or less on. And if Ann is here, we are ready to start. That's awesome. Great. So, Beth, does it look like our members are here? Can you do a quick check with participants against our list?
Yes, we have the vast majority. Also, I want people to be aware this meeting is being recorded. We're not supposed to record it without telling you.
Thanks for the reminder. I would have forgotten already. All right, so we are going to go ahead and get started. For those of you who are guests, I'm Joe Petracca. I'm the Associate Director in the Office for Exceptional Children, and I have the pleasure of being part of the Gifted Advisory Council, along with our chair, Sarah Lee. Sarah, are you on? Can you put your camera on and give a quick wave?
I'm here.
Yay! Thank you for coming. And so you can see that we have, just like our Gifted Advisory Council, we have well-represented folks with a diverse taste in music across the spectrum. So I tend to gravitate towards punk rock, don't judge. It's the time of my, it's my era. And a few odd things thrown in, like Sergio Mendes. How many people remember Sergio Mendes and the girl from Ipanema? I don't know why, it's just a family funny song that we have. So great, we're just happy that everybody is here. So let's review a little bit of the rules first. So if you are a guest, welcome. We are happy to have you. Guests may observe, they do not participate. So if you have questions, please let me know. You can send me a chat or you can send me an email. Anything else, Sarah, that we should bring up before we get started?
I don't believe so. I think you're doing great.
All right, great. So we have our meeting norms that everybody is familiar with. And you can hit the next slide, Beth. And then our feedback from our previous meeting. You know, we always take data and we'd like to show that. So we have our October results in a column, followed by our December results. And I'm thinking, you know, the team that works with me at ODE and those of you who've worked with me in the past, you know I love me some data. So I'm thinking that next time we might be fancy and make some charts. What do you think, Beth? That was a rhetorical question. You don't have to ask, or you don't have to answer. But you can see we had some really strong results, and I'm really proud of those results. So we met our meeting objectives, and the meeting time is convenient. Yeah, finding a convenient meeting time is always a challenge. Shared decision making. And you know, I always put in not only the percentage, but how many responded. So I just think it's important. If you go down to, we used our meeting time effectively in December, it was 93%. It's not a bad percentage. And that's 28 out of 30 felt that we did. So that's why I always put in the raw score. And Beth, when you're ready, you can hit the next slide. So here are some of our results that people wrote in and talked about. You know, we're ready to get moving forward on things. So that's going to be the agenda today, but people like the breakout rooms. You'll be a little disappointed today because we're not going to break out today. They appreciated the conversation leading us towards action steps and a plan for gifted education in Ohio. Beth, whenever you're ready, you can hit the next slide. Great facilitation from Maria. So thank you, Maria. And thank you for somebody for acknowledging that with her. Oh, the last one cracks me up. Joe was an excellent facilitator. I told my mom she wasn't allowed to put comments in. Again, mentioning Maria. The breakout rooms were pretty popular. And then aspects that need some improvement. So I think you will hit that today. Diversity of ideas and voices that a slightly larger group would provide. We seem to be giving lots of ideas, but don't see how they're being used. All right, hopefully we'll be able to address that today when we get to the next part of our plan. The flow, difficult to do with so many and being virtual. It is difficult. Yeah, we'll address what happened in the breakout rooms today, I believe. And somebody mentioned Dr. Ford, being privileged to have her here. And we're grateful for that as well. Yeah, when we do breakout rooms, and so for today, if you have a question and the things that we're going to be moving through in today, feel free, you can raise your hand and I'll monitor that so that, you know, if somebody has a question and needs to say something. So if you scroll up to the top, move up to the top bar, you'll see there's like an icon that says show participants. You can see who's in the room. Then there's like a little bubble that says hide conversation or show conversation. Next to that is raise your hand. If you click on that, I'll be able to see that somebody has a question. And or you can unmute and ask the question. And it also helps if you put on your camera. All right, so moving forward, we are ready to start some action planning, and that's what today is going to be. And, we needed to take the first two sessions to really begin looking at things, seeing where we are, the state of gifted in Ohio. And now we're ready to move forward. Sarah, is there anything else that I forgot to mention?
I can't think of anything.
All right, great. So I'm going to turn this over next to the gifted team. So Maria Laura, our assistant director, and our gifted program specialist, Mike Demchek and Jeff Shoemaker, to talk about the session themes that we saw from our meeting breakouts. And I'm going to go off camera, but I'm still here. So don't think I left to go to the mall or something.
All right. Hello, everyone. Maria Lohr, Assistant Director for Gifted in the Office for Exceptional Children. I think we're not going to actually right now spend a lot of time here. We did want to, show everyone some of the feedback from and the notes from all of the various breakout groups. I know last time we talked a little bit about it at the very end. A lot of this, though, you'll see it again when we talk more about establishing the work groups and kind of what our next steps are for the plan. But basically what we did was we looked through all of the feedback from the various work groups to find those common themes. And one fortunate thing was what we found was the breakout groups were all kind of aligned in their thinking about what they thought were areas we should focus on, who stakeholders were that we needed to reach out to, and sort of the process for next steps. So hopefully you'll see a lot of this from these the feedback from the breakout groups. You'll see that when we get into our discussion about establishing our work groups and kind of the focus of the work groups and what we're referring to as the pillars for the work groups. Yeah. And yeah, as you see here, we have all of the information by each group. So, Kurt was one of our facilitators, Mike, Sarah, Jeff, and myself, and all of the notes that the facilitators took. We've put them here. You will have access to this. I'm not sure if Beth had already, maybe she sent this already with the meeting materials, but if not, it is also in the file to go in and kind of look through. And then I see meeting agendas available for download. So we do have these for Gifted Advisory Council members on the Gifted Advisory Council SharePoint site, and then they are posted to the agenda item. The agenda and the presentation that we share is posted to the department's website. All right, thanks, Beth. All right, so this takes us to the next step there, moving forward. And what we wanted to do today is actually share. There were a lot of data points that council members had been asking to see. And so we actually have quite a bit of data to share with everyone. And we wanted to give everyone some opportunity to react to that data too. So we do have some time for discussion built in there. And then that will lead us into our discussion of the work groups, the structure of the work groups, and what we see as kind of how that process will work and next steps. All right. Beth, I'm not sure if, I know we moved the data slides into the presentation, but we might have done it after you had already loaded that here. So I'm not sure if your next slides are data slides or if perhaps I need to share my screen.
I just downloaded this PowerPoint this morning from SharePoint, so my next slides, however, are not data. Okay. So you might want to share.
All right. So I will get our the presentation up and get those slides for you so that we can go through our data slides. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. Hang on one second. All right, hopefully this works. If it doesn't, please let me know. All right, is everyone seeing my screen now?
Yep.
All right, ooh, I went all the way to the beginning, didn't I? Okay, here. Sorry about this. Moving forward. Okay, here we go. All right, so we are going to start today. I'm actually going to turn it over to Mike, and he's going to get us started with our data discussion. All right, Mike.
All right, thanks, Maria. Yeah, as you've heard, we have a pretty ambitious agenda for you today. So we're going to dive right into some of the data. There are really kind of two broad reasons you'll see some of the data that we talk about today. One, as you remember, many of you have requested additional pieces of data. Deeper dives in some cases, and in some cases combining, for instance, race and ethnicity with gender, just as an example, or even taking a deeper dive into identification areas. So one of the reasons we put together a broader package of that data today for you is to honor that all those requests and honor what you were asking for. And another one is, I think you'll see a lot of this data will help you get a fuller picture of what's happening in the state and will then lead to some of your decision making as we talk about pillars and work groups and what work group you want to participate on and all of those things. So it'll give you really a fuller picture of what's happening and maybe a better idea also of where you might want to place on some of those work group discussions too. So brief reminder is the rep index is something that we use to take a lot of our data and distill it into what nationally is referred to as a representation index in the research. And that quite simply is that percentage of a group in the gifted population. Many of our slides today have that both for identification, and then we have some for served because many of you have asked for some served data. So we dig into that a little deeper today also. And then it takes that over the percentage of that group in the general population so that you get a ratio or a representation index. And below 0.8 is considered to be not equitable. So that's one of those kind of lines that we use a lot of times to talk about how Ohio is doing as far as some of our underrepresented populations not really having equitable access to identification. All right, so let's dive into something you requested. We're going to talk about several slides first about screened. And this is an overview of screened and identified. And the big picture that we'll paint over the next few slides is that as a state, we are doing fairly well in screening. So students that were screened in Ohio, that has gone up gradually over the last few years. You see the 5-year trend here. So whole grade screening is, of course, something we want to maintain and we want to continue doing as the research indicates. This slide starts to set up the picture that will flush out, that will kind of flesh out a little more for you later. That with Ohio's current criteria for gifted ID, though, we're not reaching all of our students, particularly our underrepresented populations. So we're increasing as far as our screening goes, but we're still identifying around the same percentage of students in the state. The next slide shows by typology, and this also is a good example of kind of those trends that we've already talked about in identification, where for economic disadvantaged students and for students, some of our student groups across race and et cetera are having difficulty being identified. So you see the percent screened on the left there across typology. Most of our typologies are doing fairly well. There are some slight differences, but these numbers indicate that the majority of our districts are implementing whole grade screening and screening practices in the way that we would like to see. And then we see on the left the percentage identified. And you can see in some of those trends, for instance, typology 6, as all of you know, is a typology with large suburban districts that are often have a little more wealth and a little more resources. So they are identifying at greater rates. And typology and some other typologies with fewer resources and some of our underrepresented populations are identifying at lower rates.
Hey, Mike, Erica has her hand up for a question. Erica, do you want to go ahead and ask your question? Unmute.
Absolutely, thank you. So Mike, on that first slide, is the percentage, and it's probably obvious, but just in case, is the percentage ID'd, thank you. Like, let's look at 2014, 2015. Is the 16.11% who identified the percent of students who were screened who identified, or the percentage of students within the entire state who identified?
Great question. I think I know what you mean. I think a good way to explain it is maybe even how the data is reported. So that 16% is the cumulative identification in the entire state. So in EMIS, all of the districts, of course, all of you report that identification data cumulatively. So it's all students over time, what the general percentage of identification in the population is. The 43% is in a given year, what percentage of the population was screened. So it is not a one-to-one match, but it's an indication that as we increase screening, the overall trend to ID hasn't dramatically increased necessarily. Did that answer that, Erica?
That's a perfect answer. Thank you.
All right.
And I just want to jump in real quick to further clarify that this data is K-12 students who attend our traditional public schools, since those are the students that our gifted operating standards apply to. So, you know, the city, local exempted village, school districts, and K-12 students.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about some of the representation index for students who are screened. As you can see here, this is based off that data that Mike shared. You can see students without economic disadvantage are in the blue, and the ones with economic disadvantage is in the red. And you can see that they're well above that 0.8 for the representation index. So everybody is being screened. And then again, you can see we kind of break this down into typology. The representation index for students who are screened by economic disadvantage, and you can see that all of these are above that 0.8 in every typology, and you can see that in typology 8, you have the 0.54. Again, this is based off of that reporting where most of the students who are in typology 8 are already labeled with that with economic disadvantage. So it does skew that data a little bit because that group is so small. But in reality, it's just how that data is presented there, or it's how it's given in EMIS.
All right, so a similar trend continues for gender. This is the 18-19 school year. We didn't do the 5-year trend for gender only because it was one across all 5 years for both males and females for the for screening data. So one would of course be, quote unquote perfect representation. But we have, clearly both males and females have access to screening in the state of Ohio. And then you see a very similar pattern play out in our typologies where males and females are being screened at nearly identical rates and very, very close to that 1.0 representation.
Okay, the next couple slides are about the screening data and the rep index for race and ethnicity. And this is a very encouraging slide. Like we talked earlier, as a state, we're doing fairly well as far as screening, as far as reaching students with screening. And so you'll see the different student groups by race across the bottom, and all are well represented. They're all well above that 0.8 threshold that is talked about in the National Research for Equity. And that includes all of our student groups, and notably even student groups that have dramatic underrepresentation for identification. So again, setting up this kind of theme that we're reaching our students with testing, but as we've talked before, and as many of you have known for a while, we're not reaching them on the identification piece. So leading to discussions about alternative methods for identification, et cetera. So kudos to districts. We are reaching our students, and then by typology, we're fairly equitable as well. So this is that same representation index across all district typologies. Looks very similar for the most part, fairly equitable for the most part across student groups. And again, even across those student groups that have dramatic underrepresentation on the ID representation indexes. But as far as screening, as a state, we're doing a fairly equitable job at that.
All right, this is where we're going to start to transition a little bit into identification data. This is one of the slides we had shown previously to you. So you see the total population is in blue, the gifted population is in that red. Again, this is out of the FTE. This one is students without economic disadvantage. So they're the total population, they're just about 52% of the total population. And the percent of the gifted identification population, they make up 78%, all the way to 77 to 78%. And this is another one that we had shown you previously. Again, this is the economic disadvantaged students. Again, they make up around 47% of the total population, 22% of the gifted identified population. So you can see that there's a difference in if you're economic disadvantaged and without economic disadvantage, what your position is in the gifted identification population. And you can see through the 5-year trend, students with economic disadvantage are well below that 0.8 that we had talked about in all 5 years. Students who are without economic disadvantage are well represented. So you can see that there's, even though we saw the screening data increase, we saw that the identified population, that overall population hasn't changed much, and this is also represented here with looking at the economic and without economic disadvantage students over 5 years, that it also hasn't changed much.
All right, so the next slides we're going to look at relate to gender. So what this slide that you see here, this is the student population of Ohio. So we have about 51% of students in our K-12 public schools that are male, and about 49% are female. Looking at our identified population by gender, we see that the identified population in our K-12 public schools are 53% male and about 47% female, so pretty similar to the overall rate. And the representation index for that looks like this. So you see that both males and females are fairly close to 1, with our males just slightly above 1 and our females just slightly below 1. Okay, if we look at male and female identification, and this is for the 18-19 school year, the representation index for our identified students by gender and by identification category, we see that across the board, except for visual performing arts, both groups are 0.8 or above. However, we do have a few gaps in some areas. So math, for example, and science, so the STEM areas, we do see our females students lagging behind in identification. And similarly, we see our females being identified at higher rates than our males, and larger gaps there in areas such as reading and then the visual or performing arts.
All right, thanks, Maria. I'll talk about the slide in just a second. Addressing briefly one of the questions in the chat, keep in mind the one thing that is helpful for our discussion is that we use as that 5-year trend. 18-19 is the year that we end with typically on the 5-year trend, and that's helpful for a reason. In particular, as someone was wondering in the chat, the grace period for the tests that districts could use extended all the way through June of 2019. So districts had the full complement of tests, regardless of some of those tweaks that took place during the common list of approved assessments. So we did have, and districts did have, access to the full complement of testing testing options for those students over those years. All right, we'll continue to follow your questions and look for any hand raises as you have any questions. So here's where we are as far as identification. This is a very stark difference, of course. Some of what we've seen before. This is just one snapshot of that year that we just kind of talked about. fiscal year 2019 or the 2018-2019 school year, dramatic differences in identification. This is the percentage of students identified by race and ethnicity. Next slide, please.
And just to kind of clarify, what this slide is showing you is that 30% of Asian students are identified gifted, where 5% of Black students are identified gifted, 7.72% of Hispanic students, so on and so forth.
And that translates, as we've seen before, to a dramatic difference in that representation index. So visually dramatic on that graph, and of course, numerically dramatic, persistent differences across race and ethnicity on the representation index, stark differences. Similar trend for when we dig to economic disadvantage status by race and ethnicity. So a couple points to make on this chart is, this is again something that several of you have requested, wanting to break out within race and ethnicity. How does it cut across economic disadvantage? And this is a very interesting way to show that. And again, a very kind of stark reality for some of our students. On the left side, we have without economic disadvantage. We see that in many cases, students without economic disadvantage are identified fairly equitably and have a reasonable representation index. What is notable here, and I'm sure you all are seeing that, is that even our Black students without economic disadvantage fall below that threshold for equity. Even without economic disadvantage. And of course, on the other side, students with economic disadvantage, regardless of race, are always having a difficult time being identified, or on the representation index are below that 0.8 for the threshold of equity. So we can see differences across without economic disadvantage, and we can see that even without economic disadvantage, our identification rates have a stark and a dramatic difference, particularly for Black students. And then with economic disadvantage is affecting all races, but again, has a more dramatic impact on certain races for sure.
Mike, I think this is still your slide.
And Jennifer, you have your hand up, Jennifer Detmer. Do you want to go ahead and unmute
Yes,
and
please.
ask your question?
Yes, please. I was just curious. So we have you said earlier that fewer than 50% of our districts are currently doing the screening as required. That's correct, yes?
No, that's a great point to make. And Maria and Jeff might have some thoughts on that. And I'm glad you brought it up. Thanks for bringing that up. That initial slide we showed was the percentage of students that are being screened.
Okay,
and that's in any, and remember that the screening data always represents in a particular year who is screened, because the screening data in EMIS is not reported out cumulatively. It's only within a given year. So that number of percentage screen reflects that a majority of districts, because we did take a dive into, and Maria might want to say a little bit more about, we did dive into some district data about districts that were doing whole grade screening. So no, key point is that reflects the percentage of students that were screened, and it reflects that a majority of districts are whole grade screening. All right, I'm sensing that I should talk a little bit about this slide. Jennifer, I think that answered your question. If not, we can circle back for sure to that screening piece. All right, the rep index for identified by gender, race, and ethnicity was also another dive that some of you wanted us to take. So we put that into a representation index as well. And there are some subtle differences across race for female and male. In many cases, there's a slight uptick, and for Black students and for Pacific Islander students, there's kind of a slight difference from, I'm sorry, a slight uptick for males, and then for Black and Pacific Islander, there's a slight uptick for females. Keeping in mind that overall, the overall representation index looks fairly similar across gender, but there are some slight differences there that you can see. And of course, there are differences by race, as we already know.
All right. This slide is the from the 2018-19 school year. This is the percent of students who are identified by race and ethnicity by category. And so you can see that our Asian students are well represented in this graph. And we're going to do a deep dive into each section here so you get a better idea of what these are. But you can see that, for example, just looking at this, you can see that the Asian students are the highest in math. And you can see that white students are highest in reading and math. And you can see that most of the graph is actually the reading and math is the highest. And then I'm going to do, this is the percentage. So you've got just over 20, was that about 22, 23% of Asian students who are identified in math. So now let's look at a deep dive. So here is this is our first graph. This is just Asian students. And I want you to keep an eye on the left-hand side because this scale is going to change. So this is our original scale because it matches what our Asian students are doing. So you can see that our Asian students, again, they are highest in math and in reading. And you can see that superior cognitive there is about 14%. And then they drop off dramatically going from science, social studies, creative thinking, and visual arts. Go ahead and go to the...
Yeah,
go ahead,
I just
Maria.
wanted to make a note. So what we see here, particularly in areas where we have whole grade screenings, really except for creative thinking, it still kind of lags behind. Although, if we were to show you the trend, you would see that the trend did move up quite a bit for identification and creative thinking. But our areas like science and social studies, visual performing arts, where there are no whole grade screenings, those areas do kind of lag behind across all groups.
Thanks, Maria. So now we look at our Black students, and you can see on the far left, we're only dealing with, this is 3% is the tallest. So so this is not the same percentage as the on the left-hand side there is our Asian students went up to 25. This one goes to 3%. So this is that smaller group. And you can see, like, for example, superior cognitive is less than 1% of our Black students are identified as superior cognitive. And then, again, their highest ones are math and reading. And the creative thinking is 0.5%. So you can see, again, as Maria had mentioned earlier, those that are in whole grade screenings for these students are a little higher. However, they're still very, very small numbers when compared to our Asian students. And you can see for our Hispanic students, again, that the percentage is less than 5% on the left-hand side there. So you can see just under 2% of our students, our Hispanic students, are superior cognitive. Their math and their reading is also, they're very similar, but they're high, again, they're highest ones. And you can see that the creative thinking is actually one of the smaller ones of those whole grade screenings that happen. They're the smallest. That's one of the smaller groups, and then our smallest areas that they're identified in. Lastly, being the visual and performing arts, which is again referral based. So again, you can see that these students are, it's small. It looks large on the graph, but it is still a small group of students. Again, we can look at the next group, which is our American Indian students. These students, when you look at this, a couple things will stand out to you. Again, this is overall in the state, it's a small group of students. Their identified population is even smaller, so you're looking at less than 7% of the students. You can see again, math and reading is their higher points. You can see the superior cognitive students, they are just over 3%. And you can see the social studies and in this group, social studies and science is actually a little bit of an uptick compared to some other groups, but again, these are small amount of students. Creative thinking is very small, it's less than 1%. And then we couldn't even calculate the visual and performing arts because the number was so small. Again, small numbers. Our multiracial students, again, you're looking at less than 8%. You look at this on the side there. Again, math and reading is still they're most likely to be identified in. You can see that the superior cognitive students are just half of that, so they're just over almost 4%. Social studies, science, again, good numbers, but these are all small numbers. Creative thinking is another one that's very low, and then the visual and performing arts is also very small. So you can see that the main those areas that are whole grade screened do show numbers, but they're all very small. And our Pacific Islander, again, this is traditionally one of those smaller groups in the state with a smaller population. Again, math and reading still stands out. They're superior cognitive students. You have are less, but they're just almost 4% of the students are identified. This one though, they have an uptick compared to science and social studies of being identified as creative thinking. And again, the visual and performing arts wasn't calculated because the numbers were so small. So you can see that their students are different. So now, if you look at the white students, this is tops out at 12%. So again, math and reading, you can see that those are the top two areas that they're identified in. Superior cognitive is just under 6%. Science and social studies and visual and performing arts, those ones, they're not whole grade screen, but they do show that they are being identified in those areas. In creative thinking, which is the second smallest area to be identified in. So you can see majority of students are being identified in math and reading. That was consistent through all of the groups. And I think this last slide is mine, I think.
No,
That's you.
This is the slide. All right. So what we're going to do now is kind of transition the data discussion to services. So what we see here is a 5-year trend of students enrolled in our K-12 public schools and the percent of students served. We're going to show you the service data for a couple slides in this way. So out of total enrollment and then out of the identified enrollment, because we felt it was important to share all of that information. So we can see, services are increasing. And the reason why we wanted to show the total enrollment was to give a sense of how much service is actually being provided. So we know in Ohio, services are not mandated, and that's what's reflected here. So we see less than 10% of students in Ohio receive gifted service in grades, K-12 public school districts, less than 10%. So that kind of speaks to how the amount of service that's being provided. The next slide we're going to look at is service to identified students. Okay, so in our 5-year trend, again, we see that increase of services. There have been pretty significant increases over the past 5 years, going from 36% of identified students receiving service to almost 60% of identified students receiving service. And this, again, is K-12 public school districts, our city, local, exempted village, and identified students. If we look at our typologies, this is what this graph is showing. We can see, in almost every typology except for typology 8, we see a general increase in service over time. Typology 8 has kind of gone up and then back down. So they actually, their 18-19 service is equal to their 14-15% of service. So this is looking at percent of students enrolled in the typology. So what we see here is about 17% of students in typology 6 receive gifted services, where about 3.5% of students in typology 8 receive service. The next slide, we'll look at identified students within the typology. And we thought this was pretty interesting because you'll see that, for example, typology 6 did have, a higher rate of students in the typology receiving service, higher percent of students in the typology receiving service. However, if we look at identified students, they are not the highest percent of students identified in the typology receiving service, although they are above 50%. So about 54-55% of gifted identified students in typology 6 receive service, where we have a high of almost 70%, about 68% of identified students in typology 4 receive gifted services. And we kind of range between there. And then typology 8, we see about 38% or so of gifted identified students in typology 8 receive service.
All right, thanks, Maria. And I love following the chat. A couple things to mention, and these next couple slides will illuminate what Maria just showed. And one important piece to think about, and based on some information in the chat that I saw, keep in mind that earlier. So even though Maria was showing that some typologies have lower rates of identification, keep in mind that those typologies that we showed earlier are screening at very similar rates. So it's not that some typologies are dramatically under screening, if you will. It's that they are dramatically under identifying and bringing us back to this kind of alternative pathways discussion that we've been having for a long time. So that slide that Maria showed was really an indication that we're having difficulty reaching our students in the identification part, but we're screening them. So fairly equitably across the state and across typologies, we're screening. These next couple slides will also kind of show some of that with served. because what we see a lot is that the served data trails, if you will, the identification data. So for economic disadvantage status by served, these bars look fairly similar to what we've seen with identification. A little bit lower, but fairly similar. And then the rep indexes are a little bit lower for students with economic disadvantage for served, but fairly similar to the identification to the identification piece. And then across typology, this kind of brings home another point that was made in the chat. Across typology, this again is very similar to what we've seen with identification. The served numbers, the served representation indexes kind of trail the ID, meaning what we've been seeing in our data, and we'll continue to flesh out in the next few slides, is we aren't seeing significant, let's call them additional barriers to service once you're identified. What we're seeing is that the identification piece is that difficult barrier. So even though so similar representation indexes for served and for identification, setting up our discussion. The 0.98 is an interesting one and feeds to something in the chat. Keep in mind that in some typologies, particularly typology 8, but in other places, many and most of the students in a district are reported with economic disadvantage, almost in mass with economic disadvantage. So that's actually going to make that number here look a little different. If we had a true representation of the economic disadvantage breakdown in some of those districts, the numbers would look different, and we'd get a better view of it, and we'd actually see that discrepancy. That's why you don't see it here in typology 8, because by and large, all students in many districts, and particularly in many buildings in mass, if you will, are reported with economic disadvantage.
All right. I'm going to be showing you some slides here that deal with gender. As you can see here, that the percent of our served population of males and females is pretty similar, even though that you can see that males do take over 52% and females are 48%, but they're not dramatically different. When you go to the next slide here, the representation index, you can see that they are almost in perfect, that 1.00 range. So you can see over that 5-year trend that males and females are very, very similar who are being served. And then finally, the next slide that I'm going to show you here is with the typology. So again, you can see that male to female breakdown going from the state level down to the typology level is all very, very similar. They're all about 1.00. You can see in typology 8, females are higher than the males in that case. Same thing with typology 1. Again, those are well above that 0.8 that we've been talking about for the representation index.
All right, so now we're going to look at our percent of students who are served by race and ethnicity. And so what we see here, it's very similar to our identified slide, kind of follows a similar pattern, if you will. Our Asian students, a little over 18% of Asian students receive service, about 2.5% of our Black students receive service, about little over 4% of our Hispanic students, and then 6% of our American Indian students, and multiracial Pacific Islander are similar at just over 7.25%, And then our white students, just over 11% of those students are served. So if we look at the representation index for service by race and ethnicity, we will see a similar pattern, as Mike said, to that we saw for identification. And again, you know, the service data really is a mirror of the identification data. So we have particular groups that are underrepresented within our served data, and that really is a reflection of their underrepresentation in the identified data. If we look at our typologies, representation index for the 18-19 school year for students served by race and ethnicity and typology, we will see that our Asian and white students across the board are well represented. Our Black and Hispanic students across all typologies are underrepresented. Our Native American and Pacific Islander in certain typologies, those populations are so small we're not able to calculate the representation index for those students there. So it's a little bit harder to see at the typology level really what's going on in every typology with these students. But you know, we have kind of a good indication in our overall state data for these students. And then our multiracial students, we see that in many typologies they are underrepresented, where in a few typologies they are above that 0.8 threshold.
Okay, we took a deeper dive into some of the service data that we've talked about so far, as some of you had requested. So here's a brief breakdown. We have a series of line graphs. So adjust your eyes to line graphs for the next couple slides. And what we see here is a general uptick in services consistent with what we saw, you know, in the statewide data earlier by grade band, with really the largest growth, if you will, over that 5 years in districts, in the percentage of districts that report service by grade band. So the K2 grade band had the largest growth over that 5 years, although each grade band has had some growth.
And to clarify exactly what this data is, this represents districts that report at least one student served in the district. So this is percent of districts that report at least one student served. That's what these slides are showing by grade band and model.
All right, and continuing that, you asked us about models. So here we see that over that 5 year at K2, a significant amount of the growth has been in the general education model. Probably not surprisingly to many of you, but that's where a lot of growth in that K2 grade band has occurred. Slight growth in the other models as well, gifted intervention specialist and trained arts. The trained arts might have a note on it, because we did tweak for trained arts. There was an additional EMIS code added, so that could be a reason for that uptick. But we also see some growth in the GIS at K2. 3.6, similar growth for the general ed teacher model, a little reduction for the GIS model, and similar for trained arts, some similar amounts of growth for trained arts. 7.8, same trend, general education teacher model growth, a little bit of reduction for GIS, and a little bit of growth for trained arts. And 912, who would have guessed? Same trend, some growth for the general education teacher model, and a little bit of reduction, again, for the GIS, and a little bit of growth for the trained arts.
On mute.
I did want to say one thing, because just to clarify, and it works. No, sorry, it works for this slide. And I know we're transitioning. Someone else is going to do the slide, but you can go back to economic disadvantage. We will check with Michelle Neubauer. We crest the economic disadvantage data, and she gives it to us as economic disadvantage. We can clarify with her how that's reported out by districts in EMIS, like what data element she pulls out. I believe we've looked into that before, and she's actually said, like, specifically where is it similar, or how is it similar to free and reduced lunch. But we can look into that specifically, because I know there was some buzz in the chat about what that actually means at the district level. But we asked for Michelle for economic disadvantage, and that's how she gives it to us, as you've seen.
All right. Thanks, Mike. We're going to move to service models. We're going to continue with the service models. This is with students who are served by economic disadvantage status in their service models, and you can see that students without economic disadvantage are well represented. So they have quite a bit of teachers who are the gifted intervention specialists, and the general education teachers, and the visual and performing arts. When you look at the economic disadvantaged group, they are well below that, and so you can see that those groups that are without economic disadvantage are definitely providing more service than those with the economic disadvantage. The next slide is this is males and females, and again you can see that females are being served who are more in performing arts than the boys, than the males are. In the general education, you can see that they are well represented. They're very identical, except males are have a little bit of an edge for that group. And finally, the next one is by race and ethnicity. I mean, you can see that the gifted intervention specialists, general education teachers, and the visual performing arts teachers, for this group, you can see that for our traditionally underrepresented populations, they are well under that 0.8 that we continue to talk about, and in some cases they were not calculated, particularly for American Indian Pacific Islander. But the white and Asians are student groups are being served by those teachers.
All right, and then just to kind of talk a little bit about visual performing arts, we do, see some interesting data, if you will, for visual performing arts, and part of that, part of what we're seeing here is also just general low rates of identification for visual performing arts, and then low rates of service for visual performing arts kind of across the board. All right. Looking at, we're going to continue to look at representation index for served. Now, versus the slides that we just looked at and the representation index tables that we just looked at, where we were kind of breaking that down by service model, this is looking at representation index for service, generally speaking. And so what we see here is served by economic disadvantage status and race and ethnicity. And we see similar to what we saw previously, that economic disadvantage does have an impact on service. We see that all of our student groups are underrepresented in the economic disadvantage group. And then without economic disadvantage, we see every student group except for our Black students who are above the 0.8 threshold. So most students without economic disadvantage are well represented, except for our Black students. With economic disadvantage, all of our groups are underrepresented in service. All right, looking at gender by area of identification. Is this my slide? This might not be my slide. Well, I'm going to do it anyway. Mike and Jeff are being quiet, so maybe it is my slide.
I think it's your slide. It's your
All
slide.
right, wonderful. Okay, so the 1819 Representation Index served by gender and then category. We see that by and large, males and females are well represented in each group, being above the 0.8 threshold. We are kind of borderline, though, with math, where our female students are lagging behind much more significantly in service for math and science. So if you remember in the identification, again, that's kind of reflecting what's happening there for identification. So our girls are behind in those STEM areas. And then on the opposite side, we see that our boys are kind of lagging behind in reading, creative thinking, and then pretty significantly there for visual or performing arts, where our males are underrepresented in visual performing arts. All right, 2018-2019 Representation Index, looking at served by gender and race and ethnicity. This is very similar to what we saw previously with our identification, where looking at males and females, they're close there in their representation index calculations and pretty close to the overall number. We do see that sort of generally speaking, males have a slight uptick there for our Asian and our white and Pacific Islander students. It's pretty much even there for our Hispanic students. And then a slight uptick for females for multiracial and American Indian, and then a little bit more of an uptick for our females for our Black students. But again, this is similar, kind of a reflection of what is happening there with identification.
Okay, thanks, Maria. And yes, thanks. I saw some folks were asking in the chat, do we have it by race and ethnicity? And yes, we do. We would not have left that out. So as you've seen on a couple slides already, we dug into served by race and ethnicity. As Maria mentioned, it really is almost a mirror reflection. So for that reason, and because we want to leave a lot of time for another discussion, and actually two more discussions in the last 45 minutes that we have today, we're going to go through these fairly rapidly, but it does show a very similar pattern. This is the overall trend for race and ethnicity by category of identification. And then very similar slides. So if we look at in this case, we go by area of ID. So for each area of ID, we have all of the races on the slides. So you can definitely see now, and this is again is similar and would be reflected in the slides, although we had the metric just a little bit different up top for ID that Jeff went through. But similarly, a very dramatic difference in superior cognitive by race, math, reading, science, social studies. Keep in mind that we couldn't calculate some of the areas because there are too few students in some areas for some races. Here's the bar. I'm sorry, the breakdown for creative thinking identification, and then visual performing arts ID by race.
Sorry. One more thing here. Again, I think this is where you can kind of see really just the very low rates of service for visual performing arts.
All right. The next few slides I'm going to cover is basically just some summary slides that are just to go over again. This one is for the 2018-19 school year that has, this is the representation index by race and ethnicity. And you can see we've got all of the races on the left, and you can see there's the numbers between screened, identified, and served. So you have those traditionally underrepresented populations that are identified and served that are underneath that 0.8. And you can see that in the screened, everybody's above. So there's definitely some work that we've got to get done in this area for the identified and served for this group, for those groups right there. Just some observations. There is still dramatic and persistent underrepresentation that does exist for particular student groups. Many patterns are similar over 5-year trends, and the patterns are similar across all the typologies.
Additional observations, all student groups are well represented in the screening data, and then representation indexes for services are similar to those for identification. So with that, we kind of come to our bottom line. So what we are really seeing from the data is that identification is functioning as a gatekeeper. Students, by and large, do have pretty good access to screening. And then once students are identified, they are receiving service at similar levels, with some slight differences here and there, some slightly lower, some slightly higher. However, by and large, that service underrepresentation really is appears to be more of a function of the underrepresentation that is happening there for identification. So that leads us to reaction. So several people, did have questions in the chat. I unfortunately can't see the chat right now since I'm sharing my screen. So I'm not trying to ignore you, but Mike and Jeff seem to be doing a good job following the chat and whatnot. So reactions that anyone would like to share.
So it really seems like some of our conversations the last couple of meetings, at least in my group, were regarding the fact that economic disadvantagement is the leader rather than race. I mean, there's probably some correlation there. But this data really shows that the economic disadvantagement is kind of the key, at least in my opinion. So that was intriguing. Thank you for all that work with that data.
I was literally typing the same into the chat as you spoke. I think that really, really tells us we have work to do either in testing instruments, our perception of ability with students from low SES backgrounds, and or our means and modes of identifying those from low SES backgrounds need to change. And, you know, I would say of the 17 districts we work with, 2/3 are low SES, and the data that I get back from our identification absolutely mirrors what was shown. So thank you.
Yes, thank you for sharing. Anyone else? Reactions?
I agree with what Erica said, and the fact that our districts do seem to be screening at the same rates, but the students just aren't being identified, is where something would need to change. Also, I'm very concerned about, you know, this year with the COVID and the districts who are going virtual and the gaps being created, especially regarding our economically disadvantaged students, because it's bad. It's bad out there. I'm testing students and I'm not getting, you know, the same percentage of identifications even on the screenings that I'm doing by teacher referral or parent referral. So I think this is really going to impact our data in a very negative way across the state.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that point up too. I think that's definitely something, you know, we'll need to turn attention to, right? And provide attention to kind of what last school year, this school year, and the impacts that we'll see. And partly just kind of speaking to that, it's why this data that we're sharing goes to the 18-19 school year. We chose not to at this point to pull that 1920 data just because of the unusual nature and how a lot of districts weren't able to, you know, conduct screenings, those types of things for the 1920 school year. And we know, you know, there have been a multitude of challenges for the 2021 school year. But, you know, that is, you know, obviously something that, you know, we are also sharing those same kind of feelings about the impact and future impacts and for our students. All right, any other reactions, or maybe some people have shared some thoughts in the chat. I don't know, Mike or Jeff, if you've seen any there, or questions or anything like that that you might have.
Can I also add, when we're looking at some of the subgroups, that our ELL students and our twice exceptional students, I seem like I'm seeing more of them be identified as gifted in my districts. And I just wonder, you know, what impact that has on the data as additional subgroups to potentially look at in the future, because we see a lot of those listed for like gap analysis and, you know, how COVID is impacting them, but how does that also tie into gifted?
Yeah, very good point.
All right, thanks everyone. I really appreciate all of your comments, and even, you know, and comments in the chat as well. I think most of you are seeing how a lot of this data is feeding, again, toward the work groups and towards some of those, you know, let's call them harder discussions that all of you are going to have with the pursuit of, you know, some alternative methods for ID or better access to, you know, identification practices for these students. I don't know how you're feeling, Maria, but if there aren't any more questions or comments, we might move into the next thing. Anybody else have anything they want before we move on to the work group stuff?
I do want to say one thing. The comments in the chat are wonderful, guys. They're continue those conversations because it's enlightening. So thank you.
Yes.
All right.
It looks like Maria, Sylvia's hand is up.
Okay.
Sylvia Rim.
I'm not so good with the technology, but it's to me that as we look at it, first of all, the data is amazing that you've collected, the amount of data and the clarification. And in some ways, you found what we all know. But still, it's very, very dramatic, given the subject differences. But it seems to me, in order for us to deal with the socioeconomic situations, we're going to have local school norms to pick up on those. I mean, it's a change in identification, but that's the only way we're going. I mean, once students have the educational opportunities, they certainly improve in their interests and skills. So in order to identify, we're just going to have to use local norms for lower socioeconomic groups, I think. The other thing is the ease of identification is the reason we do it better in reading and math. The teachers can identify because they see the students and they're actually working. It's very, very much easier to identify in reading and math than it is in the area of creativity, for example, creative thinking, which is so important. That's enough, I think. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing, Sylvia. And yeah, I think this does kind of lead us now into the next portion and our strategy conversation with our discussion of work groups, the structure, the what we are referring to as the pillars, and next steps with our plan component.
Thanks. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was just going to say, yes, thanks for your comments, everyone.
All right, so what we did was we looked at, as I kind of referenced earlier, we looked at the feedback and the discussion from the breakout groups from our December meeting to look at what common themes were across the different groups as to areas of focus for our work groups. And what we found was a lot of topics, you know, kind of came up again and again. So like assessment and identification, talent development, high quality professional development, pre-service training, funding, accountability, social emotional needs for students, and those types of things. So those are common themes across each of the groups when discussing kind of those focus areas. We, based on, you know, kind of looking at that, looking at our data, and then also, you know, kind of considering, you know, unfortunately we can't have 7, 8, 10 work groups, that we really needed to kind of look at the focus and kind of think about what would those, high impact areas be for focus. So what we propose are the following 3 work groups. One work group looking at equitable identification practices. And so again, kind of that how are we identifying students? How could we identify students? Those types of things. Looking at another group being highly effective student supports and services. So, that would definitely encompass multiple things, themes that people mention, social emotional supports and needs, the services in general, those types of things, talent development, and equitable identification practices, speaking to the themes with, assessment, also, identification and talent development there as well. We kind of see talent development as something that could be really throughout all of the work groups. And then the final 3rd group there, job embedded professional development. So looking at, high quality professional development, pre-service training could even be something that might come out of that group as well, but looking at high quality, high impact professional development for particularly the general education teachers that are providing gifted services. Since our data shows so clearly that many districts are utilizing that model for those models, I should say, for service.
And Maria, I'll just add one thing before you move on, because this also is for Maria's benefit too, because she can't see the chat. We do appreciate that there were a couple comments about talent development in the chat there. And one of the things we considered was that talent development might be something that, and we'll get your reactions to this, of course, and see what you think. That might be embedded as one of the things that each of these groups do look at. And could even lead to some, good collaboration between and across some of the groups sometimes because of all of the elements that it kind of touches. So as Maria was mentioning, and as some folks mentioned in the chat, building on the ID piece earlier and then combining it down here, talent development really could cut across all of those work groups in a way. So thanks.
Yeah, in our discussion, we actually considered potentially a 4th work group focused on talent development, but we wanted to make sure that obviously it's something that kind of fits in multiple areas too. So it might actually, as Mike said, we kind of viewed it as something that could be there and utilize leverage, et cetera, for across all of the work groups. All right, so thinking of the structure of these work groups, we are going to send a survey out to the council members, and the survey will ask for you to identify the work group that you would like to be a part of. Now, we know that some council members right now are kind of coming to the end of their term on the council. However, we do absolutely encourage you to apply for continuing membership on the council. You are more than welcome to apply if you want to, continue being part of this work. And also our work groups, we do intend them to start meeting this year before we have any changeover on the council. So you will still, even if, you don't want to continue being part of the council, obviously we'd love to have you, but, we know different people, have maybe competing priorities. And as such, you'll get to be part of kind of the foundation of the development of these work groups. So still part of this process. Okay, so looking at the structure, so council members, identifying what are the work group areas that they feel they have expertise in, could, really contribute and do a lot of work there for around these different topic areas, or, areas where you are highly interested in being part of the work that comes out of the work groups. So there will be, like I said, there will be a survey that will come out for you to indicate your preferences, first, second, third choice, etc. And, we'll look at that and absolutely try our best to give preference to first choices, but knowing if everyone chooses the same one, we might have to go with second choices there with the work groups. But splitting into the 3 work groups and then asking for we obviously would help facilitate the work groups, but looking to members to step up into leadership positions there for the work groups and be co-leads with the work groups. And let's look here.
Maria, yeah, I think you were going to talk a little bit about the pillars.
I was, yeah. All right, so looking at the work groups and kind of the areas of focus, within those topic areas. So we have kind of those big, broad topic areas. The pillars would really cut across each of the work groups. So be it, the equitable identification practices or the high quality supports and services or professional development, each of the work groups would have the same, what we refer to as pillars. So looking at current research around that topic area, looking at best practices around that topic area, and then looking at what we refer to as opportunities for change around that topic area. So what is the research saying around that? There might even be additional data that the work group would like to look at. What are best practices, those high yield strategies and whatnot that we can put forth and implement here in Ohio, and any of those potential opportunities for change. Maybe there are things that we're doing really, really well and we want to continue doing, but maybe there are things that we can improve, and what would that look like? Would it be, a policy piece? Would it be, operating standards? What would that be? So kind of looking at those 3 different pillars around those topic areas to develop recommendations for Ohio for our strategic plan for gifted education. So the work of the work group is what is going to feed into the development of our state strategic plan. And like I said, looking around these 3 pillars, which these will be common across the different groups. All right, Mike or Jeff, is there anything else that you would like to add to the discussion of pillars before we move on to a more open discussion?
None for me. I'm interested in hearing the council's reaction.
All right. And then I should probably talk a little bit about kind of how we view this work happening. There was definite discussion in the breakout groups in the December meeting about kind of having maybe a combination of time where work groups are working in the smaller groups, but then also time that the work groups can kind of come together and share what they are doing and kind of get broader council feedback on the work of the work groups. So with that, we see that there will be need for opportunity for work groups to meet outside of the time that the council meets. So obviously those schedules and whatnot can kind of be developed after work groups are assigned. People can give feedback in those for the individual work groups as to maybe what might work for potential meeting schedule between council meetings. And then obviously having time at the larger council meetings to, discuss with everyone the work that is happening. All right, so with that, we want to open it up. We have about 20 minutes left this afternoon, or this morning, I guess. Still, technically, it's not afternoon yet. But we wanted to open it up for council members to react to the kind of our plan for moving forward. All right. Yeah,
I think we stunned everybody.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm trying to give wait time.
Yeah. The comments are in the chat. They sound really good. So kind of keep this like, I don't know, like a visual in mind, everybody. We have our work groups. Each of those would look at those 3 pillars in that area, come back to the council with their findings. And all of this is going to lead then to a recommended plan for the state. So I boiled it down to real simple. And so Tanya is saying, I'm wondering where we are going with today's meeting. Well, that's what we're doing right now, Tanya. And thinking about our next steps then in developing a plan. So give us some feedback as to the topics of discussion. Maria, can you go back to that slide that outlines the, yep, that one. So we would have these 3 work groups. And Maria was pretty clear, we can make a 4th one on talent development. We just thought talent development could be the writing theme through all of those. So we're thinking that these 3 work groups would be the way to go. So give us your thoughts. Don't be shy. All right, somebody's got their hand up. Who is it? Jennifer.
I think another theme that would cross well across all 3 of them is social emotional needs. Because I'm even thinking under identification sometimes can happen with perfectionism and anxiety, things like that. So I can see where that would be like a subtopic within all 3 topics.
Okay, great. We'll put that in, make sure we address that.
Joe, I think that each of these 3 proposed work groups do a nice job of really kind of tying together what we've heard from members of the council thus far this year. I also want the accountability piece, and if accountability should also be kind of a component of what that looks like within each of these areas.
We're
moving forward, and then
yeah. Kurt, wait a minute. Go tell us a little bit more about accountability. What do you mean by that?
So I think what I'm talking about is school and school district accountability to the students and the communities that they serve, but also to ODE as well. So, in terms of how are districts being held accountable for ensuring that they are implementing the identification practices that are established by the department? How are districts held accountable to ensure that they are being accountable for the expectations for services given by the department? And then the same for PD. So I think it's more, how are school districts being accountable to the State Department of Education on implementing expectations?
So Kurt, do you think that's one of the pillars that we should use? Create a separate work group or embed it in all three?
Oh, sorry. And while Kurt's thinking, sorry, this is Mike. I'll add something too, because it kind of feeds on what Joe said, and I'll give Kurt a minute to react. Like, what I think we should make clear that when Maria and I mentioned, and maybe even Jeff, talent development, we are not limiting what we believe you as work groups will work on. We just suggested that is that one you would want to break out separately. We were suggesting that as talent development, it had crossed our mind, but then we thought that because of the work groups, it would likely come up as a topic that all of you would address anyway. What I also want to make clear is we were not meaning to limit what you would work on. Under those pillars that Maria talked about, you will come across things in research, in current practices, and in the opportunities for change that will cross a lot of areas. And equitable ID practices as a work group, would obviously not focus only on talent development, because as a work group, that would have to address what are the possibilities for alternative methods for ID, et cetera, et cetera. So just like some of the other topics proposed, and even social and emotional supports, there could be opportunities for a lot of that cross collaboration. So I just kind of wanted to say that we weren't meaning to propose that we were limiting what work groups would work on. That as talent development was just an example of one that might cross others.
And Mike, thank you. I think that is a really great point, and so thank you for clarifying that, because basically the work groups, we're just providing a structure, but there might be things that come out of the work group, such as what Kurt was talking about there, accountability pieces, talent development pieces, social emotional pieces. All of that might be things that come out of looking into research, looking at best practices, and then looking at opportunities for change. So any of that could come out of what the work groups do. So yes, we want to make sure that there is a structure, but that work groups do have flexibility to look into whatever might kind of come out of what they are finding as ultimately recommendations from those groups for a state plan.
And sorry, I see, yeah, Amy has her hand up.
Hi, I was just thinking more about this notion of accountability, and I have concerns that if we focus in on accountability, we start to move away from services and practices that are best for students, and we start to look more at compliance. So I was actually relieved to see the proposed work groups and looking at how they can promote change in a real effective way. So those are my thoughts.
Those are all great thoughts. So you gave us, everybody's given us some great ideas for, developing the survey that we're going to put out in terms of work groups and thoughts. And we promise that we'll give you leeway, but also structure it in a way so that when you first meet, you're not just spinning your wheels. You know what? And wow, I'm going to say it again. I think I said it at the last advisory council, what a great time to be a gifted student in Ohio right now. And think of the future and how much better that's going to be. So we have great stuff happening and going to happen. And it's the work of this council that's going to drive it forward.
Hey, Joe, I should say that I kind of jumped in there a little bit. I wanted to make sure if Kurt did want to respond to your question, he had a chance. I would be remiss.
Thank you. Yeah, I did interrupt Kurt because his thought triggered something for me. So Kurt, did you have it? You had another point. Do you want to go ahead and make it, or another suggestion?
No, that's fine. I was doing my best to be very patient and quiet. No, just in response to your question around the accountability piece, like I believe it's a conversation to be had within each of the areas, each of the work groups. I just worry that if we don't have some consistent conversation about what accountability even looks like across these three work groups, we might lose some of that in conversation. So I think I would propose that there be, and I'm not saying it's necessarily another work group, but at least some time allocated for some conversation across the whole membership as to what that looks like in moving forward, just to make sure that that's not lost. But I would echo what others have shared about really opportunities to just really improve the way that we go about doing business in Ohio with gifted students. And I think we have an opportunity to, kind of blow up some old habits and old ways of doing things, and consider some fresh ideas that might have more of an impact on kids in Ohio.
That was well said. Thank you, Kurt. Because we're at a time of critical change, and it's the time to do it. All right, so we're getting ready to wrap up. Any final thoughts? And I butted in on Sarah Lee's and Maria's closing comments, so I'm going to be respectful and let them have the last 10 minutes should they need it.
I just want to make sure that everyone who has wanted to say something has had that opportunity. I don't want to move on until I'm sure and have kind of the thumbs up that we are ready to sort of wrap up today's meeting. Anyone else have anything else that they would like to speak to for related to work groups, our pillars, and kind of the structure and next steps?
Maria, when can everyone expect to see the survey?
Okay, good. So we are going to send that out after today's meeting, and should be fairly shortly after today's meeting. Beth?
Yeah, and in our PowerPoint, it says to complete the meeting evaluation in the chat box, but I'm going to send both surveys in one email to all membership after the meeting, within an hour.
Okay, so check your email inboxes today. You will get the meeting evaluation link, but that survey for the work groups and your area of interest there with the work groups will come today. And then we will work on kind of going through next steps there with that to formalize work groups, and then be in touch. All right, any other questions about or comments? All right, so hearing none, we'll say next steps, like we said, we'll be sending 2 evaluations to you. the meeting evaluation for today's meeting, and then also the work group survey that we have will be coming to you. Our next council meeting that we have will be April 28th. So that is our final one for this school year. However, we will probably be discussing additional opportunities to meet for our work groups to get started and to begin next steps there with looking at the various work group areas, the topic areas across those pillars, and ultimately leading to our state plan. So very excited about what comes next. And as Joe said, I do think it is an exciting time to be working in gifted education here in the state of Ohio, but also one opportunity for our students. So thank you everyone for joining us today and this afternoon. We very much appreciate it, and thank you to those who contributed to our conversations. And I can't wait to see what's in the chat. I'm kind of sad that I can't see it right now. But yeah, thank you everyone who has joined us. With that, anyone, Joe, Sarah, any closing comments?
Just thank you all. Oh,
Yeah,
go ahead.
thank you for your work on all of this, compiling all the data, and thank you, Beth, for making sure we're always rolling the way we need to roll. So getting those minutes out to us and making sure we have the survey. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. Thank you. Yes, thank you, Beth.
Thank you everybody for coming today and for your time and expertise. We have the best and brightest on this council across the state. So thank you all. We'll be in touch. Look for the survey soon. Don't be shy about volunteering to be a facilitator of a group. Bye, everybody. Thank you for coming. Enjoy the rest of your day. I'll hang around. I have another meeting coming up shortly.